For 30 years, my father never asked for my advice, until one quiet afternoon, he looked at me differently and said something I was not ready to hear. Growing up, my father was not a man who paused. He was the one with answers. Always. If the car made a noise, he knew what part was failing before the hood was even open. If I struggled with homework, he would stand over my shoulder and explain it in a tone that made it clear I should have understood it already. If something broke in the house, he fixed it. If I asked a question, he gave instructions. Not options. Not discussion. Just instructions. He was decisive, confident, solid as a brick wall, and about as warm. In our house, conversations were short and practical. He would ask, "Did you finish it?" Not, "How did it go?" He would say, "You need to try harder." Not, "Are you okay?" I cannot remember a single time he asked what I thought about anything that mattered. Not once did he ask how I felt. Approval from him was rare. When it came, it was thin and conditional, like a receipt you had to earn. I remember bringing home a science project in 5th grade. I had worked on it for weeks. Stayed up late painting the board, rewriting the labels so they looked neat. I got the highest score in the class. When I showed him, he looked it over for maybe 10 seconds and said it was good, but next time I should not leave the edges uneven. I nodded like that made sense, like that was normal. Over time, I stopped expecting anything else. I learned early that questioning him led nowhere. He did not yell much. He did not need to. His silence did the work for him. If he was disappointed, the air in the room changed. It got heavy. You felt it in your chest. I became good at reading his moods. Good at staying out of the way. Good at being self-sufficient. There were moments I wanted more. I remember sitting in the bleachers after a high school game, scanning the crowd for his face. He showed up, but he stood at the top, arms crossed, expression unreadable. On the drive home, he broke down my mistakes with surgical precision. He never once mentioned the play I made that won us the game. I told myself that was just how men like him showed love. By preparing you for a hard world. By keeping you sharp. By never letting you get too comfortable. So I built myself that way. By the time I left for college, I did not need much from anyone. I handled my own problems. Made my own decisions. Built my own stability from the ground up. Our relationship settled into something distant but functional. We spoke on holidays. Talked about work. About the weather. About practical things. Never about anything real. It became normal not to share. Normal not to reach. Normal not to expect. For most of my life, my father stood above me like a finished monument. Complete. Unshakable. A man who did not need help and certainly did not ask for it. Which is why, years later, when he looked at me across his kitchen table and opened his mouth differently than he ever had before, I felt something shift in the air. And I knew, without understanding why, that nothing between us would ever be the same again. If you grow up under a man who never doubts himself, you start believing doubt is a weakness. My father, Richard, ran our house the way he ran everything else in his life. Efficient, ordered, no wasted motion. He believed there was a right way to do things and a wrong way. Most of the time, his way was the right one. At least that is how it felt. He worked in construction management for over 30 years. He built things for a living. Office buildings, schools, subdivisions that all looked the same from the outside. I used to think that was fitting. He liked systems, blueprints, clear plans with clean lines. No messy emotions bleeding outside the margins. I cannot remember him ever asking for input. When we moved houses during my sophomore year of high school, I found out the same way you find out about a dentist appointment. He told me the date, told me what school I would transfer to, told me to pack my room by Friday. That was it. I remember standing in my bedroom that night, looking at the walls I had painted myself a dull gray, thinking I should feel something bigger. Anger, sadness. But mostly I felt small, like I was a piece of furniture being relocated. Once, when I was about 12, I made the mistake of challenging him. It was something minor. He had decided I would quit baseball to focus on academics. I loved baseball. It was the one place I felt loose, like I did not have to measure every word. I told him I did not want to quit. The room went quiet. He did not raise his voice. He just looked at me for a long second and said that he knew what was best, that I did not yet understand how the world worked. He said feelings were temporary. Discipline lasted. That was the end of baseball. After that, I stopped pushing back. There is a strange kind of loneliness that comes from living in a house where nothing explodes. No screaming. No chaos. Just quiet authority. You learn to edit yourself. to keep your questions internal, to turn your emotions into private projects. I got good grades, chose a practical major, built a career in finance because it made sense, because it was stable, because I knew he would approve of stable. The few times I brought home achievements, promotions, milestones, he would nod, say that was what he expected. He never said he was proud, not directly, but sometimes he would mention my job to his friends. I would overhear him in the garage with a neighbor, saying my son works in investment management now. That was as close to pride as it got. I learned to translate that. There were moments, though, where I felt the gap. I remember coming home from college one Thanksgiving and trying to talk to him about a girl I had been seeing. Not for advice, just to share something. He listened for about 20 seconds before steering the conversation toward whether she came from a good family and what her father did for work. That was when I realized something uncomfortable. He did not really see me. He saw the outcome, the performance, the trajectory. Over time, I stopped offering pieces of myself he did not know what to do with. By the time I turned 30, I had my own house, my own routines, my own sense of control. I handled my life without asking anyone for help. I paid my bills early, maintained my place, built my own blueprint. Our relationship settled into predictable patterns. A phone call every few weeks, brief updates, safe topics, the stock market, weather patterns, minor home repairs, never fears, never regrets, never the heavy stuff. If you had asked me then, I would have said that was just how we were. Some fathers and sons are not the hugging type. Some relationships function better at arm's length. It felt stable until the first crack appeared, and it did not come with shouting or anger. It came with something far more unsettling. Silence. The first crack did not look dramatic. It did not come with raised voices or some big confession. It showed up in the smallest way possible. He forgot something. My father had never been a forgetful man. He remembered deadlines, license plate numbers, the exact square footage of the house we lived in 20 years ago. If you asked him what tool he used on a job in 1998, he could probably tell you the brand. So when he called me one evening and asked what day my birthday fell on that year, I felt something strange move through me. At first, I thought he was joking. He was not. There was a pause on the line after he asked. A pause that stretched longer than it should have. I told him the date. He cleared his throat and said he had meant something else. Then he shifted the conversation to his water heater and how it was making a clicking sound. I let it go. But after that, I started noticing things. He would repeat stories. Not just once, but word for word. A conversation about a contractor who messed up a tile job came up 3 different times in 2 weeks. The third time, I tested it. I asked him if that was the same guy who had underbid the school project last spring. He hesitated, said he did not remember mentioning it before. That hesitation stayed with me. He also stopped finishing certain tasks. The yard, which used to look like a magazine spread, started looking uneven. Tools left out. Mail piling up near the door. My mother, who had always quietly orbited around him, picking up the small pieces, seemed tired in a way I had not seen before. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off, said he was just slowing down. Getting older. That happens. But it did not feel like normal slowing down. One afternoon, I stopped by their house unannounced. I found him in the garage, standing still in the middle of the room, holding a wrench like he had forgotten why he picked it up. When he saw me, he straightened immediately. The old posture snapped back into place. He said he was reorganizing. The garage looked the same as it always had. We stood there in that quiet space, dust floating in the light from the small window. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain. It was subtle, a slight narrowing of his eyes, a faint crease in his forehead that had nothing to do with irritation. It unsettled me. Part of me wanted to ask if he was all right, but that question had never existed between us before. It felt foreign in my mouth. Instead, I commented on the weather. On the drive home, I felt something I did not want to name. Fear, maybe, or the beginning of it. I had built my life on the assumption that he was immovable, that he would always be the fixed point on the horizon. Even if we were distant, he was steady, predictable. The authority, the idea that he might not be that anymore felt like the ground shifting. Then came the call from my mother late one evening. Her voice was tight. She told me he had gotten lost driving home from the hardware store, a route he had driven for over 20 years. He insisted it was traffic, construction, anything but confusion. I could hear him in the background, annoyed that she had called me. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every recent interaction. The forgotten birthday, the repeated stories, the half-finished tasks, the look in the garage. It hit me slowly. The man who had always known what to do might not know anymore. And if that was true, I had no idea what that meant for either of us. But I would find out sooner than I expected. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was quiet. Nothing dramatic. No emergency room calls. No loud arguments. Just an ordinary Tuesday that split my life into before and after. I had stopped by their house after work. My mother had mentioned that the insurance paperwork for their home had gotten confusing, and I offered to look at it. That part was not unusual. Over the last few months, I had started stepping in quietly, calling repair services, sorting through mail, scheduling appointments he used to handle without blinking. He hated it. You could see it in the way his jaw tightened when I took over a phone call. He would hover nearby, arms crossed, pretending he was just listening. That day, he was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. No television on, no radio, just him and a stack of papers in front of him. The light from the window hit his hair differently than I remembered. More gray than brown now. Thinner too. He looked up when I entered, and for a second, I saw something I had never seen in his eyes before. Not irritation, not impatience, uncertainty. I sat across from him and started flipping through the documents. Insurance adjustments, property tax reassessments. It was not complicated, just tedious. He had always been good at tedious. He watched me read. Usually, he would comment, correct me, tell me to check a line I missed. But that afternoon, he stayed quiet. After a few minutes, he cleared his throat. There was a long pause, longer than any pause I had ever heard from him. Then he said it. He asked what I thought he should do. Just like that. No sarcasm, no joke, no edge in his voice. He did not say it casually either. He leaned forward slightly. His hands rested flat on the table. Waiting. I froze. It sounds small when you say it out loud. A father asking his son for advice about paperwork. It happens all the time. Ordinary families probably experience it without thinking twice. But for us, it felt like gravity had shifted. He had never asked what I thought. Not about school. Not about career. Not about life decisions. Not once in over 30 years. And now he was sitting there, looking at me like I might actually know something he did not. My first reaction was confusion. I almost looked over my shoulder, like he was talking to someone else. I asked him to repeat it, even though I had heard him clearly. He did. Slower this time. What do you think I should do? His voice did not crack, but it was softer. In that moment, my chest tightened in a way I did not expect. I should have felt validated. Finally seen. Finally acknowledged as capable. Instead, I felt disoriented. Part of me wanted to answer immediately. Step into the role without hesitation. Be steady. Be decisive. The way he always had been. Another part of me felt something darker rise up. Where was this question when I was 12 and wanted to keep playing baseball? Where was it when I chose my major? Where was it when I sat in those bleachers hoping for one word of pride? Now, suddenly, he wanted my thoughts. I looked at him carefully. Really looked. The lines around his mouth were deeper. His shoulders slightly rounded. His hands, once so firm and steady, rested a little too still on the table. He was not the monument anymore. He was a man. Aging. Slipping, maybe. Trying to hold on to control in a world that was starting to blur at the edges. And somehow, that realization did not feel triumphant. It felt heavy, because this was not just about insurance forms. It was about something neither of us had ever said out loud. And as I opened my mouth to answer him, I realized this was not just a question. It was a surrender, and I had no idea what accepting it would cost me. I answered him. Not quickly, not confidently, but I answered him. I walked him through the paperwork, explained which option would lower the premium long term, showed him where the fine print mattered. I kept my tone steady, calm, practical, the way he always had. He listened. That was the part that unsettled me the most. He did not interrupt, did not correct, did not push back. He just nodded slightly and said that made sense. He even asked me to explain one section again. Explain it again. Those 3 words echoed in my head long after I left their house. For the rest of the week, I felt off balance, like I had stepped into shoes that did not quite fit yet. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be him asking something else. It was. 2 days later, he called and asked about refinancing options. The week after that, he wanted help reviewing a contractor estimate. Then came a question about whether it made sense to downsize the house. Downsize. That one hit harder. He had built that house with his own hands, chosen the layout, measured the beams, talked about square footage like it was a badge of honor. The idea of leaving it felt impossible, and yet he was asking. Each time he did, I felt the same strange mix of emotions. There was a quiet satisfaction in being capable, in being trusted, in knowing I could carry something he once carried alone. But there was also resentment. I did not like that it took decline for him to see me this way. I did not like that the first real question he ever asked me came from necessity, not curiosity. And I hated myself a little for thinking that. Because the truth was, he was struggling. The official diagnosis came not long after. Mild cognitive impairment. Early stage. Not catastrophic yet. But not nothing. When the doctor said it, my father nodded like he was being briefed on a construction delay. Minimal reaction. He asked about timelines, treatment options, statistics. He did not ask how it would feel. On the drive home, he stared out the window. I watched his reflection in the glass. The strong profile I had known my entire life looked smaller somehow. That night, I sat alone in my living room, thinking about how many times I had wished he would let me in. Let me matter. Let me be more than a project under supervision. Now the door was cracked open, and it was happening because he had no choice. The dynamic shifted slowly after that, but it shifted all the same. I started handling more decisions, attending appointments, keeping track of medications. My mother leaned on me in ways she never had before. And my father, bit by bit, leaned too. He never said it outright, but I could see it in the way he watched me now. Not from above, not from the top of the bleachers, from across the table. Equal height. That should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing on ground that was giving way. Because every time he asked for my opinion, I saw something else behind it. A quiet acknowledgement that he could not hold everything alone anymore. And the more he needed me, the more I felt a different kind of ache rise up. Not anger this time. Grief. For the father I had never fully had. And for the man he was slowly becoming. But the hardest part was still ahead. Because one evening, after a long silence, he asked me something that had nothing to do with paperwork, contractors, or finances. And that question would force both of us to confront something we had avoided for decades. It happened on a Sunday evening. We had just come back from one of his follow-up appointments. The doctor had explained things in careful, measured language. Progression, monitoring, lifestyle adjustments. Words that tried to soften reality without denying it. My father had listened the same way he always did. Straight-backed, focused, asking about numbers instead of feelings. When we got back to the house, my mother went upstairs to lie down. The silence between us felt different that day. Thicker. He sat in his usual chair in the living room. The same brown recliner he had claimed for over 20 years. I took the couch across from him. The late afternoon light cut across the room, dust drifting in slow motion. For a long minute, neither of us said anything. Then he spoke. Not about the doctor. Not about treatment plans. He asked if I thought he had been too hard on me growing up. The words did not register at first. I thought I misheard him. He repeated it, slower. Do you think I was too hard on you? That question landed in a place deeper than the one about insurance. It was not logistical. It was not practical. There was no correct answer written in fine print. I felt my throat tighten. For decades, I had imagined a conversation like this. In some version of it, I would finally tell him everything. About baseball. About the bleachers. About the constant pressure to be better, sharper, more efficient. I would explain how lonely it felt to be raised by someone who only saw results. But sitting there in that room, looking at him now, none of those rehearsed speeches came out. He did not look defensive. He looked unsure. His hands rested on his knees, fingers laced together. That was new. He had always sat with arms crossed or hands firm on the armrests. This posture felt smaller, contained. I realized something in that moment. He was not asking to defend himself. He was asking because he did not trust his own memory of who he had been. That realization hit harder than the question itself. Part of me wanted to protect him from the truth. To say no. To tell him he had done his best. That everything was fine. Another part of me wanted to finally be honest. Not cruel. Not dramatic. Just real. The silence stretched. I told him that he had high expectations. He nodded slowly. I told him that sometimes it felt like I had to earn my place in the house. His jaw shifted slightly at that. I did not accuse him. I did not list grievances. I just described what it felt like to grow up wanting more warmth and structure. He listened. Really listened. There was no interruption. No correction. No explanation about discipline or the real world. After a while, he let out a long breath. He said he thought he was preparing me. He said his father had been harder. He said no one had ever asked him how he felt either. That was the closest he had ever come to vulnerability. It was not poetic. It was not emotional in the way movies make it seem. His voice stayed even, but there was something underneath it. A crack in the concrete. For the first time, I saw him not just as my father, but as someone shaped by his own blueprint. Someone who had learned that love meant preparation, not softness. I felt resentment shift inside me. Not disappear, but move. Because suddenly, the hierarchy between us felt thinner. He was not the finished monument anymore. He was a man trying to understand the past before parts of it slipped away. He looked at me again and asked if I had turned out all right despite him. Despite him. That phrasing stayed with me. I told him I had built a good life. I told him I learned discipline from him. I did not tell him about the years I spent feeling unseen. Not yet. Because something else was rising in me. Something unexpected. Empathy. And it scared me. Because empathy meant letting go of some of the anger I had carried like armor. And I was not sure who I would be without it. But what he said next would force that choice in a way I could not avoid. He leaned forward slightly, eyes steady on mine, and asked me something no father had ever asked me before. He asked if I was proud of him. When he asked if I was proud of him, the air in the room shifted again. That question did not belong to the version of my father I had known for 30-plus years. He had never sought validation, never needed reassurance. Pride flowed in one direction in our house, and even then, it was rationed. Now he was sitting across from me, waiting. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Not exactly sadness either. It was more complicated than that. It was the collision of every memory I had carried and the man sitting in front of me now. I had imagined telling him I was proud of him in some triumphant way one day. After he softened. After he acknowledged everything. After he apologized clearly and directly. But that was not what this was. He was not asking for a ceremony. He was asking quietly, carefully, like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. I thought about the nights he stayed late at work. About the way he made sure we never worried about bills. About the steady presence, even if it was distant. I thought about how he showed up to my games, even if he stood at the top of the bleachers. He had been there, in his way. I also thought about the pressure, the constant measuring, the feeling that I was always slightly behind some invisible standard. Both things were true, and that was the part that made it hard. He watched me while I searched for words. His eyes did not challenge me. They did not dare me to respond correctly. They simply waited. That was new. I told him I was proud of the life he built. His shoulders shifted slightly at that. Not quite relief, but something close. I told him I was proud of the way he provided, of the way he worked, of the fact that he showed up, even if he did not always know how to connect. My voice stayed steady, but my hands felt tight against my knees. Then I added something I had never said before. I told him I wished we had talked more when I was younger, that sometimes I wanted less correction and more conversation. The words did not come out sharp. They came out tired. He did not flinch. He nodded slowly. He said he did not know how to do that. No excuses. No defensiveness. Just that. I did not know how to do that. For years, I had pictured him as emotionally unavailable by choice. Like he deliberately withheld something. But sitting there, I saw something else. He had simply never been taught another way. The hierarchy between us felt thinner than ever in that moment. Not because he was weaker. Not because I was stronger. But because we were finally on the same level of uncertainty. He leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window. He said he worried sometimes that I had stopped needing him too early. That one caught me off guard. He said I became independent so fast. That I handled things on my own. That he thought he was raising me to be strong. But maybe he had raised me to walk away. Walk away. I had never considered that he might have felt distance too. I told him I did not stop needing him. I just stopped asking. That silence that followed felt different from all the other silences we had shared over the years. It was not heavy. It was honest. For the first time, we were not standing in roles. Not father above son. Not son seeking approval. Just two men, both trying to make sense of the blueprint they had inherited. He did not apologize in some dramatic way. There were no sweeping declarations. But he reached forward and placed his hand on the table between us. Not commanding. Not firm. Just there. And I realized something quietly devastating. I had spent most of my life wanting his approval. And now, sitting across from him, I did not need it anymore. Not because I stopped caring, but because I had built my own sense of worth without it. And somehow, that seemed to matter to him more than anything else. Still, there was one last shift coming. One that would not happen in that living room. One that would happen weeks later, in a place neither of us expected. And it would finally make clear what this reversal truly meant. The final shift did not happen in a warm living room with filtered light and careful words. It happened in a hospital parking lot. A few weeks after that Sunday conversation, my father had a minor episode. Nothing catastrophic. He got confused at the grocery store. Could not remember where he parked. A stranger found him sitting in his truck, staring at the dashboard like it held instructions he could not read. They called my mother. She called me. By the time I arrived, he was already outside, leaning against the side of the building. He looked irritated more than scared. Embarrassed, maybe. I walked up to him slowly. For most of my life, I would have waited for him to speak first. Waited for direction. For explanation. This time, I did not. I asked if he was all right. He nodded, but it was the kind of nod that said he did not fully trust himself. We stood there in silence for a moment. Cars moving around us. People coming and going like it was just another day. Then he said something unexpected. He said he hated not knowing. Not knowing where he parked. Not knowing what day it was without checking twice. Not knowing if he would forget something important next. His voice did not break, but it was quieter than usual. I realized then that the man who had built his entire identity on certainty was now living inside uncertainty. And that was terrifying for him. For a split second, I felt that old resentment rise again. The memory of being told feelings were temporary. That discipline lasted. Now feelings were all he had. But the resentment did not stay. Because I could see it plainly now. He was scared. Not of me. Not of losing authority. Of disappearing piece by piece. He looked at me and said he did not want to become a burden. That word hit harder than anything else. Burden. He had spent his whole life being the one who carried things. Problems. Bills. Decisions. Expectations. Now he was afraid of being carried. I stepped closer to him. Not in a dramatic way. Just enough that he did not feel alone in that wide parking lot. I told him he was not a burden. He did not argue. That was new too. For the first time in my life, he let me lead without resistance. I drove him home. I handled the follow-up call. I made the adjustments. But more than that, something invisible had shifted. He was no longer the man above me. And I was no longer the boy beneath him. We were simply two people navigating something neither of us had planned for. Later that night, after I had settled him into his chair and my mother had gone to bed, he stopped me before I left. He said he was glad I turned out steady. Steady. That was his word. I realized then that, in his own language, that was pride. And I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph. Not victory. Just clarity. The roles had shifted quietly. Gradually. Almost without us noticing. He had spent his life preparing me for a world that did not ask permission before it changed. Now I was preparing him for one. And the strangest part was this. The moment I stopped needing his approval was the moment he finally saw me as an equal. But there was still one final realization left. One that would come not from something he said, but from something I understood on my own. The last realization did not come in a dramatic moment. It came weeks later, in my own kitchen. I was standing at the sink, staring out the window at nothing in particular, when it hit me. I was not angry anymore. For years, I had carried a quiet inventory of things unsaid. Moments I replayed. Conversations I wished had gone differently. I told myself I had moved past them, but they lived somewhere in the background. Subtle. Persistent. That night, I tried to summon one of those memories. The baseball conversation. The bleachers. The science project. The sharpness was gone. The events were still there. But the charge behind them had softened. Not because he had apologized in some sweeping way. Not because he had transformed into a different person. But because I finally understood something simple. He had given me what he knew how to give. It was structured. It was disciplined. It was limited in warmth. But it was not empty. For so long, I measured him against the father I wished I had. One who asked more questions. One who offered vulnerability first. One who said I am proud of you without needing to translate it from tone. But that version of him never existed. And somewhere along the way, I stopped needing it to. I realized that the resentment had been tied to approval. I wanted something specific from him. When it did not come, I built my own approval system. My own standards. My own stability. By the time he finally asked what I thought, I had already become the person I was trying to prove myself to. That was the quiet twist in all of this. I thought his question marked the beginning of my importance. But I had been important long before he asked. His need did not create my worth. It only revealed that he saw it. A few days later, I was back at their house helping him sort through old files. We sat on the floor of his office, papers spread out between us. At one point, he handed me a folder and asked if I could decide which documents to keep. He did not hover, did not double-check. He trusted my judgment. And I realized something else in that moment. When I was a child, I thought authority meant having all the answers. Now I understood that authority also meant knowing when to ask. He had spent decades being the one with instructions, with solutions, with certainty. Asking me for advice did not mean he had become smaller. It meant he had allowed himself to be human. The hierarchy that defined our relationship for so long had dissolved without ceremony. Not because he lost power, not because I gained it, but because time moved us to the same level. One evening, as I was leaving, he stopped me at the door. He looked at me in a way he never had before. Not appraising, not evaluating, just seeing. He said he was glad we were talking more now. That was it. No dramatic embrace. No emotional breakthrough. Just that. And somehow it was enough. Because in that simple sentence, there was acknowledgement. There was mutual ground. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like I was performing in front of him. I felt like I was standing beside him. Still, there was one final piece I needed to accept. Not about him. About myself. And that realization came quietly, the next time he asked for my advice. Only this time, it felt different. The last shift did not feel heavy. It felt quiet. A few months after the hospital parking lot, after the appointments and paperwork and small adjustments that became routine, my father asked me another question. We were sitting at the same kitchen table where he first asked what I thought he should do about insurance. The same chair, the same stack of papers. But this time there was no tension in the air. He was considering selling the house. Not immediately, not urgently, just planning ahead. For most of my life, that house had been his proof. Of work, of success, of control. Every beam and nail had a story attached to it. Letting it go would have once felt like defeat. Now, he looked at me and asked what I thought the right time would be. And something inside me felt steady. Not defensive, not resentful, not disoriented. Steady. I realized I was no longer reacting to the role reversal. I was simply living in it. I asked him what he wanted. That question hung between us for a second. He had spent decades telling me what was best. Now I was asking him to name his own preference. He leaned back and thought about it. He said he wanted to make the decision before someone else had to make it for him. There it was. Clarity. He was not surrendering control. He was choosing how to hand it off. I told him I thought that made sense. That planning ahead would give him more say, not less. We talked through options, numbers, timing. But beneath the practical conversation, something else was happening. There was no hierarchy in that room. No invisible measuring stick. No boy trying to impress his father. No father guarding authority. Just two men thinking through the future. At one point, he looked at me and said he trusted my judgment. Simple sentence. But it landed deeper than any criticism ever had. For years, I thought I needed him to say he was proud of me in order to feel complete. But sitting there, listening to him trust me with decisions that once defined his identity, I understood something clearly. I had already become the man I was trying to prove myself to. His approval was no longer the foundation of my worth. It was a bonus, a gift, not a requirement. As I stood up to leave that evening, he stayed seated at the table, watching me the way he used to watch construction crews at a job site, observing, evaluating. But this time, there was no critique in his eyes, just recognition. I walked toward the door, and he called my name. I turned. He said he did not know how much time he would have where things stayed this clear. He said he was glad we had this stretch of understanding. Then he added something that surprised me. He said he used to think being the father meant always having the answers. But maybe, he said, it also meant knowing when your son has them. That was it. No swelling music. No dramatic embrace. Just truth. On the drive home, I felt something settle inside me completely. Roles shift. They have to. Parents age. Children grow. Authority softens. Independence hardens and then softens again. And somewhere in that exchange, equality emerges. For most of my life, our relationship was defined by hierarchy. But in the end, it was defined by change. The moment I stopped needing his approval was the moment he saw me clearly. Not as someone to instruct, not as someone to shape, but as someone capable of standing beside him. and that was more than I ever thought I would get.